She thought the billionaire was her enemy, but fate had other plans. Every great story begins not with power, but with struggle. In a quiet village far from the bustling cities, a small piece of land stood like a heartbeat, its soil rich, its trees whispering stories of love and sacrifice. Yet what seemed ordinary to outsiders was a treasure to the woman who owned it. To her, it wasn't just land. It was her husband's last gift, her children's inheritance, and the thread that kept her tied to hope. Hey, stick with me till the very end. You won't believe what happened next, and I promise it's worth every second. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. It means a lot to our growth. Let's go. The widow, Esther, rose each dawn to tend her fields, her hands roughened by years of labor, her face lined with both hardship and quiet strength. Villagers admired her resilience, though many pitied her too. For in a world where wealth ruled, Esther's land was her shield against hunger, but also the target of powerful eyes. Unknown to her, plans had already been drawn in glossy boardrooms miles away. A billionaire, renowned for his ruthless business tactics, had set his gaze upon her land. To him, it was prime territory for expansion, nothing more than numbers on a map. But to Esther, it was sacred ground where her husband had taken his last breath defending their home from flood years ago. The widow never imagined that her simple farm, watered by sweat and tears, would become the battleground between her and a man who seemed untouchable. But fate had written a story far beyond her sight, a story where power, pain, and unexpected kindness would collide. The land stood quietly, waiting, just like Esther, unaware of the storm approaching. Sometimes the most painful battles don't begin with fists or fire, but with ink on paper. For Esther, the widow, the storm began one morning when she found a folded envelope pinned to her wooden door. It carried the weight of authority, stamped, signed, and coldly official. She held it in trembling hands, her heart racing before her eyes even traced the words inside. The letter was short, merciless. She was to vacate her land within 30 days. No explanations, no room for appeal. Her farm, her memories, her children's only inheritance. Dismissed with a legal notice. The paper might as well have been a sword cutting through her soul. Neighbors whispered when they saw her reading it, their eyes heavy with pity. Everyone knew the name behind it, the billionaire who owned half the town already. To him, Esther's field was just another square of land, another step in his empire's endless hunger. But to Esther it was everything. Clutching the notice, she sank onto the old bench her husband had built years ago. Tears blurred the words, but determination began to harden in her chest. She would not give up so easily, not without a fight. In towering glass buildings where the air smelled of money and ambition, plans were being drawn that would change countless lives. The billionaire, Alexander Kane, sat at the head of a long conference table, his sharp eyes scanning the blueprints before him. To his board of directors, the land was nothing but space to be conquered, ripe for warehouses, factories, and profit. Alexander was a man who measured value not in memories or sweat, but in numbers and growth. Every acre was a stepping stone, every home a potential obstacle. When his assistant pointed to Esther's farm on the map, he barely flinched. "Acquire it," he ordered, his voice cold and absolute. To him, her land was no different from the dozens of others he had already swallowed into his empire. Yet, something about that small patch of green drew longer silence in the room than he intended. The expansion plan promised wealth, jobs, and power, but in its shadow loomed broken homes and shattered lives. And while Alexander believed he was only building his legacy, fate was quietly weaving another. One that would bind his empire to a widow's tears and a truth he had long buried. Some meetings are planned with courtesy and handshakes, but others spark like lightning. Unexpected, fierce, and unforgettable. When Esther was summoned to the town council office, she walked in with her heart pounding, clutching the eviction notice like a weapon. And there he was, the man whose name carried fear in every household, Alexander Kane, the billionaire. Their eyes met, and in that instant, two worlds collided. Alexander's presence was commanding, his tailored suit flawless, his voice steady and sharp. He expected submission, the kind he was used to from people who couldn't match his power. But Esther didn't bow. Her voice, though trembling at first, rose with the strength of years of survival. She told him her land was not for sale, not at any price, not after her husband's sacrifice and her years of toil. To Alexander it was shocking. A widow daring to defy him so openly. The room thickened with silence, like fire meeting ice. He was power without pity, and she was pain without surrender. Neither backed down. And though Alexander dismissed her words with a cold smirk, something in her fierce eyes struck him deeper than he cared to admit. Strength is not always measured in armies or wealth. Sometimes, it rests in the heart of one woman who refuses to surrender. When Esther returned home after facing Alexander Kane, the villagers gathered around her, expecting defeat in her eyes. But instead they saw fire. The widow stood tall, her eviction notice folded tightly in her hand, her voice steady as she declared she would not leave her land. Word spread quickly that she had stood face to face with the billionaire and did not waver. Some whispered she was foolish, others admired her bravery. For Esther, it wasn't about pride, it was about survival. That patch of soil fed her children, reminded her of her late husband's sacrifice, and gave her purpose each morning. To abandon it would mean abandoning everything she had fought to preserve. Meanwhile, Alexander was unsettled. He was used to resistance crumbling at the mention of his name. But this widow, poor, fragile-looking, yet unbreakable, defied him. The more he tried to dismiss her, the more her determination haunted him. In her eyes, he saw not just defiance, but a mirror to a part of himself he had long buried. Fear travels faster than truth, and in Esther's village, the name Alexander Kane carried the weight of dread. Around firesides and in crowded markets, people spoke of him as if he were a storm, unpredictable, destructive, and impossible to resist. Some said he had crushed families overnight, others swore he bought entire towns just to erase them. Every story painted him as a man with no heart, no mercy, only hunger for more. Children clung to their mothers whenever sleek black cars passed through the dusty roads, and shopkeepers lowered their voices when mentioning his name. Esther heard these stories growing up, but they became more real now that she stood against him. The villagers urged her to surrender, warning that no one defied Alexander Kane, and walked away unscathed. Still, Esther's resolve only deepened. If she bowed now, what lesson would she leave her children? Far away, in the city's glittering towers, Alexander heard whispers too, not of his ruthlessness, but of the widow who dared to fight him. He dismissed them outwardly, but inside, her defiance gnawed at him. For the first time in years, the ruthless billionaire felt something unusual: curiosity. When power casts a shadow, entire villages learn to live in silence. Esther's defiance had lit a spark of hope in some, but in many, it awakened fear. For years, Alexander Kane had been a name people only whispered about. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a force of nature, a storm that swept away whoever stood in his way. Now that Esther had challenged him, the village braced itself for the consequences. Men avoided gathering at the square, fearful of being seen supporting her. Mothers urged their children not to visit her farm, afraid of retaliation. Some even begged Esther to reconsider, warning her that her stubbornness might cost the whole village dearly. To them, resistance was foolishness, and survival meant obedience. But Esther refused to bend. If one voice cannot rise against injustice, she told them, then we are already defeated. Meanwhile, Alexander's influence tightened like a noose. Supply trucks stopped visiting Esther's land, buyers turned away from her harvest, and rumors spread that he would make an example out of her. Fear gripped the village, but Esther's quiet courage stood in stark contrast, like a single candle refusing to be snuffed out in the dark. Every piece of land holds a memory, and Esther's farm carried one carved deep in her heart. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain lashed against the roof, she would remember her husband, David, the man who had once stood where she now stood, protecting their home with his very life. His sacrifice was not written in books or celebrated in parades, but it lived in the soil, in the trees, and in the quiet corners of the farm. Years ago, when a violent flood threatened to sweep away their land, David had fought tirelessly to secure the foundation, working day and night with nothing but his hands and courage. Exhausted, he fell ill, and his body never recovered. He had given his strength to preserve their future, leaving Esther with their children and the land as his final gift. To her, every harvest was proof of his love, every sunrise over the field a reminder of his promise. Now, facing Alexander Cain's empire, Esther drew on those echoes. Her husband's sacrifice whispered to her heart, "Do not give up." And though the village trembled in fear, Esther stood firmer, carrying not just her own will, but the legacy of the man she loved. They said a person's eyes reveal their soul, but Alexander Cain's eyes told a different story. Cold, unflinching, and unreadable. His gaze could silence a boardroom and crush a man's confidence in seconds. When Esther first looked into those eyes across the council table, she felt as though she were staring into winter itself. Beautiful, distant, and merciless. To Alexander, emotions were weaknesses. He had trained himself to bury them long ago, locking away grief and compassion behind an icy mask. It was this shield that built his empire and earned him the reputation of a ruthless billionaire. To him, Esther was just another opponent, a fragile obstacle daring to stand in his way. And yet, as he replayed their encounter in his mind, something unsettled him. Her trembling hands spoke of fear, but her eyes had carried a fire that even his coldness couldn't extinguish. Back in his office, Alexander stared out of his glass window, the city lights reflecting in his steely gaze. To his staff, he was a visionary. To his rivals, he was a predator. But deep within, behind those cold eyes, there flickered a shadow of something else, something he refused to acknowledge. And soon Esther would be the one to draw it out. Sometimes, the heaviest battles are fought not on the fields of war, but in the quiet corners of a child's heart. Esther found her youngest son, Daniel, sitting alone by the wooden fence, his small face streaked with tears. In his trembling hands was the eviction notice he had secretly taken from her table. His voice cracked as he asked, "Mama, are we going to lose our home?" The words pierced Esther deeper than any sword could. She knelt beside him, gathering his small frame into her arms, her own tears threatening to fall. But she knew she could not let him see her break. Instead, she wiped his face gently and whispered, "This land is your father's gift, and I will fight for it with everything I have." Her voice shook, but her resolve grew stronger with each word. In that moment, Esther wasn't just a widow, she was a warrior. The sight of her son's tears became fuel for her spirit. She realized that her battle was not only against Alexander Cain, but against despair itself. And while the billionaire had wealth, she carried something far more powerful, a mother's unyielding love. In the darkest moments, help often comes from places least expected. Esther had braced herself to stand alone, but fate had other ideas. One evening, as she was returning from the village well, a soft voice called out her name. She turned to see Mr. Adewale, a retired lawyer who had lived quietly at the edge of the village for years. Few paid him attention, but he had been watching her struggle closely. "I heard about the eviction," he said, his eyes kind but serious, "and I know the man you're up against. Alexander Cain is powerful, yes, but not untouchable. If you are willing to fight, I will stand with you." Esther was stunned. For so long, she had carried the burden alone, believing no one would dare challenge the billionaire. Yet here was a man with knowledge, wisdom, and the courage to step forward when others stayed silent. That night, Esther felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't known in weeks. With Mr. Adewale's guidance, she began to see that her fight wasn't just emotional. It could also be strategic. She wasn't entirely powerless anymore. For the first time, it seemed the billionaire might not have the final word. The walls of the courtroom carried an air of intimidation. For Esther, who had never stepped inside such a place, it felt like walking into the lion's den. On one side sat Alexander Kane, flanked by a team of polished lawyers in expensive suits. Their confident smirks told her they had crushed many like her before. On the other side stood Esther, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a worn Bible for strength. And beside her, the unexpected ally, Mr. Adewale, calm and steady. The judge's gavel struck, and the battle began. Not with fists, but with words, evidence, and law. Alexander's lawyers presented contracts, maps, and statistics, painting Esther's land as insignificant compared to the greater good of economic growth. Every word was sharpened like a blade, meant to dismantle her resolve. But then Mr. Adewale rose. His voice was firm, his arguments rooted in both law and humanity. He reminded the court of Esther's rights, her late husband's sacrifice, and the billionaire's pattern of exploitation. All eyes shifted from Esther's trembling frame to the unshaken resolve in her lawyer's words. For the first time, Alexander's cold eyes flickered with irritation. The widow had not come to bow. She had come to fight. The past has a way of echoing into the present, especially when secrets refuse to stay buried. After the tense courtroom session, Esther returned home exhausted, but her mind couldn't rest. That night, as she sat by the flickering lantern, an elderly neighbor named Mama Ruth visited. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as she leaned closer and whispered, "Esther, do you know who Alexander Kane's father was?" The widow frowned, shaking her head. Mama Ruth's eyes softened with pity. Years ago, his family came from this very region. His father was known for his cruelty, and many say he built his fortune on the suffering of the poor. Alexander may wear fine suits now, but he walks the same path as his father once did. The words unsettled Esther, not because they painted Alexander as ruthless. She already knew that, but because they revealed a deeper wound. Perhaps his coldness was not just ambition, but inheritance. As the whispers of the past spread quietly among the villagers, Esther began to see her enemy differently. Alexander Kane was not just a faceless billionaire. He was a man carrying shadows from long ago. And sometimes, shadows leave cracks where light can still break through. Some words remain too heavy for the tongue, so they find refuge on paper. One restless night, long before the eviction notice arrived, Esther had sat by her small wooden desk and poured her heart into a letter. It was not to a judge nor to a friend, but to Alexander Kane himself. In it, she wrote of her husband's sacrifice, of the nights she went hungry so her children could eat, and of the soil that carried not just crops but memories. The letter was raw, unpolished, yet powerful. She begged him, not as a widow seeking pity, but as a human appealing to another human. She wrote, "If you take this land, you are not just uprooting trees, you are tearing apart the last pieces of my husband's life." But when the ink dried, Esther folded the paper and placed it in a small box under her bed. She doubted a man like Alexander Kane, cold, unreachable, and ruthless, would ever read, let alone care. That letter remained hidden, untouched, but alive with meaning. Little did Esther know, fate had its way of bringing secrets to light, and the words she never sent would one day strike the very heart she believed untouchable. Some storms rage outside, while others rage within. That midnight both arrived together. Dark clouds rolled over the village, lightning split the sky, and rain hammered the fragile rooftops. Esther lay awake, listening to the furious downpour, her mind as restless as the heavens. Each clap of thunder reminded her of battles yet to be fought, and each flash of lightning illuminated her fears of losing everything. Suddenly, she heard the sharp creak of her wooden door. Startled, she rushed to the front, only to find her eldest son drenched and shivering. He had run out to protect the goats before the storm worsened, and in his trembling voice he asked, "Mama, will the storm take our home too?" Esther pulled him close, her heart heavy. She knew he wasn't only speaking of the weather, he meant the storm called Alexander Kane. Meanwhile, miles away, Alexander sat in his glass mansion, staring at the same storm through tall windows. To most, he was untouchable. But that night, the thunder stirred memories he had long buried, memories of his childhood, when storms meant fear, hunger, and loss. Two souls, worlds apart, lay awake under the same midnight sky, unaware that fate was already weaving their paths closer. Every empire has cracks, and every powerful man carries a shadow the world never sees. Behind Alexander Kane's cold eyes and ruthless reputation lay a pain he never allowed anyone to glimpse. That stormy night, as lightning cut across the sky, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat alone in his study. The portraits of his parents hung on the wall, faces that stirred more bitterness than warmth. Alexander's childhood had been anything but golden. His father, a hard, unforgiving man, built wealth on broken backs and demanded perfection from his only son. Compassion was mocked, weakness punished. His mother, fragile and silent, faded under the weight of it all, leaving Alexander to grow up learning that love was fleeting and trust was dangerous. To survive, he built walls so high that even he could no longer see beyond them. Yet, despite all the wealth and power surrounding him, loneliness gnawed at Alexander's core. The world admired his empire, but when the lights dimmed, he faced only silence. And though he never admitted it, the widow's fiery defiance had unsettled him. Not because she threatened his empire, but because she reminded him of something he had lost long ago: humanity. Fate often binds strangers not through fortune, but through scars. On the surface, Esther and Alexander seemed to live in two different worlds. One clothed in simple fabric and dust, the other wrapped in silk and steel. Yet beneath those layers, both carried wounds that shaped their souls. Esther's wound was visible in her weary hands, in the absence of her husband, in the fight to keep her children fed. Alexander's wound was hidden, buried beneath power and pride, but it bled just the same. As Esther knelt in her small field one morning, her mind replayed memories of her husband's sacrifice. The nights of sickness, the silent tears she had shed, the lonely mornings she rose with no one beside her. Every furrow in her land carried echoes of loss. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his office tower, staring at the city below, haunted by a father who had crushed softness out of him and a childhood where love was always conditional. Two lives, two wounds, different in form but equal in depth. And though neither of them knew it yet, those wounds were the very thread that fate would use to weave their stories together, turning enemies into something far more complicated. Sometimes fate doesn't knock. It crashes in, uninvited, leaving lives forever altered. It was a quiet morning in the village when the peace was shattered by the screech of tires and the crash of metal against stone. Villagers rushed to the scene, and there, by the bend of the old dirt road, lay a black luxury car overturned, smoke curling from its hood. Inside was none other than Alexander Kane. For a moment, fear held the crowd still. This was the man they despised, the ruthless billionaire who threatened their lands. Yet as groans of pain escaped his lips, instinct took over. Among the first to reach him was Esther's eldest son, who cried out for help. Soon, strong arms pulled Alexander from the wreckage, blood streaking his forehead, his suit torn and soaked. Esther, hearing the commotion, rushed forward, only to freeze when she saw who it was. Her heart warred with itself. This was the enemy, the man who had sworn to take everything from her. And yet, lying helpless before her, he was just a man, broken, fragile mortal. In that moment, Esther faced a choice that would change both their destinies: to walk away or to save the one who sought to destroy her. Sometimes the hardest truths are revealed not by adults, but through the unguarded words of a child. After the accident, Alexander Kane was brought to Esther's modest home to recover, since the village clinic lacked the resources to treat him fully. It was an awkward arrangement, an enemy resting under the same roof as the woman he had tried to uproot. The villagers whispered, but Esther allowed it, more from duty than compassion. One evening, as Alexander lay weak on a mat near the fire, Daniel, Esther's youngest son, tiptoed closer. With innocent curiosity, he stared at the billionaire. His small eyes filled with both fear and wonder. Then, in a voice soft but piercing, he asked, "Mister, if you already have so much, why do you want to take away our little home?" The question hung in the air like a heavy stone. Esther froze, embarrassed, while Alexander's usually sharp tongue found no words. For the first time in years, someone had cut through his armor. Not with anger, but with innocence. Daniel's question was not an accusation, but a plea for understanding. And though Alexander did not answer, something shifted inside him, a crack forming in the cold walls he had built. Walls are built to keep others out, but sometimes they keep the heart trapped within. Alexander Kane had spent his life behind walls of pride, power, and indifference. Yet inside Esther's small home, surrounded by simplicity and kindness, those walls began to tremble. He watched as Esther moved about the house, tending to her children, offering him food despite her limited means. No one had ever treated him with such humanity, not even when he had all the money in the world. At first, he resisted. He scoffed at her meals, refused her offers of help, and kept his words cold. But Esther did not argue or curse him. Instead, she showed him quiet strength. Each evening, Daniel's innocent laughter echoed through the room, and Esther's eldest son respectfully offered him water, even though they knew who he was. Slowly, Alexander felt something unfamiliar: shame. Shame that he, a man with endless riches, had tried to take everything from this family that had so little, yet still gave freely. One night, as the rain pattered softly on the roof, Alexander caught himself smiling faintly at a story Daniel told. He quickly masked it, but Esther noticed. The ice was melting. The billionaire's walls, though not broken yet, had begun to crack. Every powerful man carries a secret, and Alexander Kane was no different. To the world, he was ruthless, unshakable, and untouchable. But beneath that facade was a truth he had buried so deep that even he tried to forget it. Nights in Esther's home made it harder to silence the memories, and one restless evening, the mask began to slip. Esther had risen to fetch water when she overheard low groans from the room where Alexander rested. She hesitated at the doorway, watching as he tossed in his sleep, his face twisted in pain. Words slipped from his lips. Please, not commands. Father, please. Enough. Not again. The billionaire who terrified a whole village was reduced to a broken child reliving old wounds. Esther froze, her heart torn between pity and suspicion. What darkness haunted this man? When he awoke, she asked nothing, but Alexander caught the way her eyes lingered on him. He hated that look, not of fear but of understanding. He quickly turned away, snapping, "Mind your own business." Yet deep inside he knew she had seen too much. The secret he fought to keep hidden, the scars of an abusive past, was now dangerously close to the surface. Not all deals are signed on paper. Some are written in silence, sealed in the quiet beating of two hearts. Alexander Kane had made countless business agreements in his life. Ruthless, calculated, always in his favor. But here, in the humble widow's home, he found himself facing a deal unlike any other. It was not about money, land, or power. It was about something he had spent years avoiding: compassion. Esther never asked him for mercy, yet her every action spoke louder than words. She offered him food when she had little to spare, treated his wounds without hesitation, and never once reminded him of the pain he had caused her village. Her children laughed in his presence, chipping away at the cold shell he wore. Slowly, Alexander began to question himself. Why am I here? Why does her kindness affect me more than any negotiation I've ever won? One evening, as he watched Esther tuck her children into bed, Alexander whispered words that surprised even him. Maybe there's another way. A way where I don't take what's yours. Esther turned, shocked. He wasn't offering a business deal. He was offering something deeper, an unspoken promise that, for once, his choices might be guided not by greed, but by heart. A single voice can be silenced, but when voices join together, they become thunder. For weeks, the villagers had whispered their fears in the shadows, afraid of the billionaire's power and his endless reach. But after Alexander's accident and his unexpected stay in Esther's home, something began to stir. It was not just gossip. It was courage, faint at first but growing stronger with each passing day. When rumors spread that the company was moving forward with its plan to seize the widow's land, the people decided enough was enough. Men who once lowered their heads now clenched their fists. Women who had cried in silence now raised their voices. The marketplace buzzed with defiance, and for the first time in years, the village gathered in the square. Not to beg, but to resist. Esther, though weary, stood at their center, her voice steady as she declared, "We have nothing left to lose but everything worth fighting for." From the youngest to the oldest, the villagers pledged to protect their land. Their rising spirit sent ripples through Alexander's heart. Watching from a distance, he felt an unfamiliar pang: guilt. The people he had sought to break were stronger than he imagined, and their unity would force him to choose which side he truly belonged to. For so long, Esther had seen Alexander Kane as nothing more than a heartless destroyer of lives. He was the shadow threatening to erase her husband's sacrifice and her children's future. But fate has a way of blurring lines, and slowly, what once felt like unshakable enmity began to change. The walls between them, once made of steel, now stood cracked and fragile. It happened one quiet evening after the villagers' uprising. Exhausted but resolute, Esther returned home to find Alexander waiting near the doorway. His face was softer than she had ever seen, stripped of arrogance. "I was wrong," he said, his voice unsteady. "You're not just fighting for land, you're fighting for life itself. And maybe I was never your enemy at all." The words struck Esther deeply. She searched his eyes and, for the first time, saw not the ruthless billionaire but a man haunted by his own battles. Their shared wounds, his hidden scars and her visible struggles, connected them in a way neither had expected. They were no longer enemies, but two broken souls beginning to see each other not through the lens of hate, but through the fragile light of understanding. Sometimes redemption isn't found in grand speeches or golden towers. It's written in the soil, in the places where ordinary lives take root. For Alexander Kane, the land he once saw as profit now became the mirror of his own brokenness. He had come to destroy, yet standing on the widow's farm, watching her children run through the fields their father once tilled, he realized he had stumbled upon the only chance at redeeming himself. The decision didn't come easily. His company demanded results, investors pressed for expansion, and walking away would mean financial backlash. But for the first time in his life, Alexander's heart outweighed his empire. He summoned his lawyers and, to their utter disbelief, ordered them to rewrite the contracts. The widow's land would no longer be touched. It would remain hers forever, legally protected. Not only that, he pledged funds to restore the village school and market, investments that would strengthen the people rather than exploit them. When Esther heard the news, tears welled in her eyes. Her land was safe, but more than that, her husband's sacrifice had not been in vain. Alexander, the man she once saw as her enemy, had chosen mercy over power. In saving her land, he was saving himself, rewriting the legacy he once thought unchangeable. Power is often written in ink, but true change is written in fire. The day came when Alexander Kane returned to the village with a thick envelope in his hand. Inside were the contracts, cold, lifeless documents that once carried the power to erase Esther's land and uproot her future. He had signed many like them before without hesitation. But this time his hand trembled. This time the weight of the paper felt heavier than steel. The villagers gathered in the square, unsure of his intentions. Some whispered in fear, others in hope. Esther stood silently, her children clinging to her sides. Then, before the eyes of all, Alexander struck a match. The flame caught quickly, devouring the papers that once held their doom. Gasps rose from the crowd as ashes floated into the sky like black snow. "This land is yours," Alexander declared, his voice strong yet uncharacteristically vulnerable. "No one will ever take it from you again." The villagers erupted in cheers, tears streaming down their faces. Esther watched the fire with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The man who once threatened her world had set it free. In the crackling of the flames, a chapter closed, not just for her land, but for Alexander's soul. The day the papers burned was the day he began to rise from the ruins of his past. Apologies are easy when spoken by the weak, but when uttered by the powerful, they carry the weight of 1,000 storms. Alexander Kane had built an empire by never admitting fault. He had crushed competitors, silenced critics, and signed papers that ruined lives without flinching. Yet here, in the heart of the very village he once planned to erase, he stood before men, women, and children whose trust he had shattered, and for the first time, his iron tongue bent to humility. "I came here as a destroyer," he began, his voice echoing over the square. "I thought land was just soil and numbers on a page. But I was blind. This land holds your memories, your sacrifices, your future. I wronged you." His words trembled, but they were not empty. The villagers listened in stunned silence, some with tears, others with cautious hope. Esther watched him closely, her heart torn. This was the same man who had once sworn to take everything from her. Yet now he stood stripped of pride, offering what no money could buy, remorse. In that moment, Alexander Kane was no longer the billionaire who wielded fear like a weapon. He was simply a man seeking forgiveness, not through wealth, but through sincerity. Whether the village would accept his apology remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. His heart had begun a transformation no empire could undo. For years, Esther's mornings had begun with uncertainty, never knowing if her land would still be hers tomorrow, never sure if her children's laughter could survive the weight of struggle. But on this day, as the sun broke over the horizon, its golden rays seemed to whisper of a future she had almost stopped believing in. The shadow of fear had lifted. Her land was hers, her home was safe, and her heart carried a strange, new peace. She rose early, stepping into the fields her husband once tilled. The earth felt different beneath her feet, not because it had changed, but because she had. No longer a widow fighting desperately against the world. She was now a woman standing on the threshold of renewal. Behind her, her children chased each other, their laughter pure and unburdened. For the first time in years, Esther allowed herself to smile without fear of what tomorrow might bring. From a distance, Alexander watched quietly. He did not step forward or demand recognition. This was her dawn, her moment of triumph. Yet, as he stood there, something stirred within him. Pride, not in himself, but in her resilience. The woman he once tried to break had become his mirror, teaching him that true strength is not found in wealth, but in the courage to keep standing when the world tries to knock you down. Empires are built on steel and stone, but families are built on trust and love. For years, Alexander Kane believed his empire was enough, that power, money, and influence could fill the emptiness within him. Yet as he spent more time in Esther's village, he realized that the greatest wealth wasn't found in skyscrapers or contracts, but in the warmth of a child's smile and the strength of a widow's faith. The man who once measured his worth by boardroom victories now found himself sitting at Esther's modest table, sharing simple meals. Daniel would chatter endlessly, asking him questions no billionaire had ever faced, while Esther's eldest son looked to him with a cautious respect that slowly grew into something deeper. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt like he belonged, not as a conqueror, but as part of something fragile yet profoundly real. His empire still stood, vast and powerful, but it no longer defined him. In Esther's home, he wasn't Alexander Kane, the ruthless tycoon. He was simply Alexander, the man learning that family, whether by blood or by choice, was the only empire worth building. And in this discovery, both he and Esther found something they thought they had lost forever. A future shaped not by fear, but by hope. Fate rarely explains itself. It simply weaves lives together in ways no one can predict. Esther had once believed her story would end in loss. Her land taken, her children left adrift, her husband's sacrifice forgotten. Alexander Kane had once believed his life would end in power. Riches stacked high, walls of stone and steel shielding him from the world. Yet here they stood, side by side, proof that fate's greatest gift is not fortune, but transformation. On the morning of the village's harvest celebration, the air buzzed with laughter, music, and gratitude. For the first time in years, Esther's people celebrated without fear of eviction or hunger. At the center of it all, Esther stood with her children, her heart swelling with pride. And beside her, not as an enemy but as a friend, perhaps something more, stood Alexander, humbled by the second chance life had given him. As the villagers raised their voices in song, Alexander looked at Esther and whispered, "I thought I came here to take everything, but in truth, this place gave me what I never had: family, purpose, peace." Esther's eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with hope. Fate's final gift was not the saving of land, but the healing of hearts, proof that even enemies can become the unexpected instruments of each other's redemption. Thank you for watching through. Hey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And while you're at it, smash that like button and support me by subscribing to the channel. It means a lot to me. Thank you.